The phone call that would shatter Frank Sinatra's world came at 9:15 p.m. on December 8, 1963. With trembling hands, Frank answered the ringing phone at his Lake Tahoe compound, expecting a casual conversation with his 19-year-old son. Instead, a cold, unfamiliar voice delivered the words that would destroy him. "We've got your kid, Sinatra. If you ever want to see him alive again, you'll do exactly what we say." Frank Jr. had been kidnapped from his dressing room at Harrah's South Shore room, snatched by amateur criminals who thought they could use America's most famous entertainer's son as their ticket to easy money. But what they had really done was unleash 72 hours of pure hell that would tear apart the Sinatra family, expose Frank's deepest vulnerabilities, and prove that even the most powerful man in entertainment was helpless when criminals targeted his children. "They took my boy to hurt me," Frank screamed to his security team as FBI agents swarmed his compound. "Everything I've built, everyone I know, none of it matters if I can't protect my own son. They want to destroy me by destroying him." The kidnappers demanded $240,000, a fortune in 1963, but Frank would have paid millions to get his boy back. What he couldn't pay was the emotional price that would haunt the Sinatra family forever. The kidnapping that was supposed to last hours stretched into 3 days of agony that transformed Frank from America's most confident entertainer into a broken father, begging strangers for his son's life. If you're fascinated by the moment when unstoppable power meets unstoppable fear, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This is the story of how 3 amateur criminals brought Frank Sinatra to his knees and changed his family forever. The Perfect Target, December 8, 1963. Frank Sinatra Jr. was performing at Harrah's South Shore room in Lake Tahoe, following in his father's footsteps with a singing career that showed promise but lived forever in the shadow of the Sinatra name. At 19, Frank Jr. was old enough to perform professionally, but young enough to still need his father's approval and protection. The kidnappers, Barry Keenan, Joe Amsler, and John Irwin, were not professional criminals. They were young men from wealthy families who had convinced themselves that kidnapping Frank Sinatra's son would be easy money from a father who could afford to lose $240,000 without missing it. Frank Jr. was the perfect target for amateur criminals, recalled FBI agent Wesley Grapp, who led the kidnapping investigation. He was famous enough to generate massive ransom demands, but he didn't have the security protection that surrounded Frank himself. The kidnappers thought they could grab him, collect the money, and disappear before anyone could stop them. The kidnapping was shockingly simple. Keenan and Amsler posed as delivery men and knocked on Frank Jr.'s dressing room door at approximately 9 p.m. When Frank Jr. opened the door, they forced their way in, tied him up, and carried him out through a back entrance while he was scheduled to be on stage performing. Frank Jr.'s trumpet player, John Foss, discovered the empty dressing room and immediately called hotel security. By 9:15 p.m., hotel management was trying to reach Frank Sr. at his Lake Tahoe compound to deliver the devastating news that his son had vanished without a trace. The kidnappers' plan was amateurish, but initially effective. They had studied Frank Jr.'s performance schedule and knew exactly when he would be alone and vulnerable. However, they had no realistic plan for collecting ransom money or avoiding law enforcement detection. Frank Sr.'s reaction to the kidnapping call was immediate panic, followed by furious determination. "Get the FBI. Get everyone." "I don't care what it costs or who you have to call," Frank ordered his security team. "Find my son and bring him home." The media discovered the kidnapping within hours. turning Frank's family crisis into a public spectacle that would make the ordeal even more painful for everyone involved. The ransom demand. December 9, 1963. The kidnappers contacted Frank the morning after the kidnapping with their ransom demands and proof that they really had his son. Frank Jr.'s voice on the phone, frightened but alive, convinced Frank that he was dealing with criminals who were desperate enough to hurt his boy if their demands weren't met. "They want $240,000 in small bills," Frank told the FBI agents who had taken over his compound. "They say they'll kill him if I involve law enforcement, but they'll kill him anyway if I don't pay. How do I choose between my son's life and doing what's right?" The FBI's position was clear. No ransom payments and full cooperation with law enforcement efforts to rescue Frank Jr. and capture his kidnappers. However, Frank's position was equally clear. His son's life was more important than law enforcement success or criminal justice. Frank was caught in an impossible situation, recalled FBI agent Dean Elson. The Bureau couldn't authorize ransom payments, but Frank couldn't risk his son's life by refusing to cooperate with the kidnappers. Every decision carried the possibility of getting Frank Jr. killed. Frank's mob connections created additional complications for law enforcement cooperation. The FBI suspected that Frank might use underworld contacts to locate and rescue his son through methods that would embarrass the Bureau and potentially compromise the criminal investigation. "We had to watch Frank as closely as we watched for the kidnappers," admitted Agent Grapp years later. Frank had resources and connections that could have turned the kidnapping into a mob war if he decided that law enforcement wasn't moving fast enough to save his son. The media circus surrounding the kidnapping intensified on December 9th, as news outlets realized that Frank Sinatra's son was being held for ransom. Television crews and newspaper reporters surrounded Frank's compound, turning his family's agony into public entertainment. Frank's emotional state deteriorated throughout the day as hours passed without progress in locating his son. "I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't think about anything except getting Frank Jr. back," he told close friend Dean Martin during a desperate phone call. The kidnappers' amateurish planning began creating problems for them as law enforcement pressure intensified. They were holding Frank Jr. in a rented house in Canoga Park, California, but had no secure plan for collecting ransom money without exposing themselves to capture. The FBI versus Mob Dilemma. December 10, 1963. By the second day of the kidnapping, Frank was facing an agonizing choice between FBI cooperation and using his mob connections to rescue his son. Sam Giancana and other organized crime figures had offered to handle the situation through methods that guaranteed Frank Jr.'s return, but would compromise Frank's relationship with law enforcement forever. The mob told Frank they could have his son back within 24 hours, recalled family friend Peter Lawford. All Frank had to do was step aside and let them handle the kidnappers their way. Frank was tempted because he knew the mob didn't make empty promises about things like that. However, Frank also understood that accepting mob assistance would make him permanently indebted to organized crime, while potentially making Frank Jr. a target for future criminal exploitation. The decision would affect not just the immediate crisis, but the entire future of the Sinatra family. The FBI increased pressure on Frank to refuse mob assistance while maintaining complete cooperation with law enforcement efforts. Agent Grapp made it clear that any mob involvement would compromise the Bureau's ability to rescue Frank Jr. safely and prosecute his kidnappers successfully. We told Frank that mob involvement would turn the kidnapping into a war zone, where his son was most likely to get killed in the crossfire, recalled Agent Elson. Frank understood the logic, but logic doesn't comfort a father whose son is being held by criminals. Frank's emotional state was deteriorating rapidly as the second day passed without his son's return. He was sleeping only in brief intervals and eating almost nothing, while his mood alternated between rage and desperation that frightened everyone around him. The kidnappers called again on December 10th, with increasingly frantic demands for ransom payment. They were clearly feeling law enforcement pressure, but remained determined to collect their money before releasing Frank Jr. "You can hear how scared they're getting," Frank told the FBI agents monitoring the ransom calls. "Scared people do stupid things, and my son is the one who'll pay the price if these amateurs panic and decide they can't let him go." Media coverage intensified on the second day as the story became national news that dominated television and newspaper coverage across the country. Frank's every movement was photographed and analyzed, turning his family's crisis into public spectacle that made the situation even more difficult. The Breakthrough and Rescue. December 11th, 1963. The FBI breakthrough came on December 11th when agents traced one of the ransom calls to the Canoga Park house where Frank Jr. was being held. The kidnappers' amateurish security had finally betrayed them, giving law enforcement the opening they needed to rescue Frank Jr. safely. The rescue operation was planned with extreme care to ensure Frank Jr.'s safety while capturing his kidnappers. FBI agents surrounded the house at dawn, while Frank waited at his compound for news that would either reunite him with his son or confirm his worst fears. The call came at 6:47 a.m., Frank recalled years later. "Agent Grapp told me, 'We have your son. He's safe and the kidnappers are in custody.' I broke down completely. 3 days of hell ended with those words, but the relief was so overwhelming that I couldn't function for hours." Frank Jr. was physically unharmed, but emotionally traumatized by his 72-hour ordeal. The kidnappers had treated him relatively well, but the constant fear and uncertainty had left psychological scars that would affect him for years to come. The kidnappers' capture revealed the amateurish nature of their planning and execution. Barry Keenan, the ringleader, had convinced his friends that kidnapping Frank Sinatra Jr. would be easy money. But none of them had realistic plans for collecting ransom or avoiding capture. "They were amateurs who thought they could outsmart the FBI because they had watched too many movies," explained Agent Grapp. "Their planning was so poor that we would have caught them even without the phone trace. They were doomed from the moment they decided to target the Sinatra family." Frank's reunion with his son was emotional and private, but the media coverage was intensive and intrusive. Television cameras captured Frank Jr.'s return to his father's compound, turning a private family moment into public entertainment that embarrassed and angered Frank. The emotional toll on both Frank and Frank Jr. was enormous and would affect their relationship permanently. The kidnapping had exposed Frank's helplessness and Frank Jr.'s vulnerability in ways that changed how they related to each other and the world around them. The Trial and Media Circus, 1964. The kidnapping trial became a media sensation that prolonged the Sinatra family's agony for months after Frank Jr.'s rescue. The prosecution needed Frank and Frank Jr. to testify about the kidnapping, forcing them to relive the trauma publicly, while defense attorneys tried to portray the entire incident as a publicity stunt. The defense strategy was cruel and absurd. Claimed that Frank Jr. had staged his own kidnapping to generate publicity for his singing career. The suggestion that the Sinatra family would traumatize themselves for media attention was insulting and hurtful. But it created headlines that prolonged the family's suffering. Having to sit in court and listen to lawyers claim that I kidnapped my own son for publicity was more painful than the original crime, Frank testified during the trial. These criminals took my boy and then tried to destroy our family's reputation when they got caught. Frank Jr.'s testimony was particularly difficult, as defense attorneys tried to portray him as a willing participant in a fake kidnapping. The young man had to convince a jury that his terror and trauma were real, while his kidnappers sat nearby, claiming innocence. The media coverage of the trial was intensive and often sensationalized, with tabloid newspapers suggesting that the kidnapping might have been connected to Frank's mob associations or staged for publicity purposes. Every detail of the Sinatra family's private life became public entertainment. The trial was worse than the kidnapping in some ways, Frank Jr. recalled years later. During the kidnapping, I only had to fear for my life. During the trial, I had to fear for my reputation and my family's honor, while the whole world watched and judged us. The jury ultimately convicted all 3 kidnappers, with Barry Keenan receiving the harshest sentence. However, the legal victory felt hollow to the Sinatra family because the public trial had created new trauma and humiliation that overshadowed the criminal justice success. Frank's relationship with the media was permanently damaged by their coverage of the kidnapping and trial. He became increasingly suspicious of press attention and protective of his family's privacy, understanding that media interest could turn personal tragedy into public entertainment. The long-term damage, 1965 and beyond. The kidnapping's psychological impact on Frank Jr. was severe and lasting. The young man struggled with anxiety and fear that affected his performing career and personal relationships for years after the traumatic experience ended. Frank Jr. was never the same after the kidnapping, observed family friend Sammy Davis, Jr. The trauma changed his personality and made him fearful and suspicious in ways that limited his career and personal happiness. The kidnappers didn't just take him for 3 days. They took his confidence and peace of mind permanently. Frank Sr.'s relationship with his son became more complicated and protective after the kidnapping. Frank became obsessively concerned about his children's safety while struggling to balance protection with allowing them normal lives and independence. The kidnapping also affected Frank's relationship with law enforcement and his mob connections. While Frank had ultimately cooperated with the FBI, the experience had shown him the limitations of both legal and illegal protection methods when his family was targeted. Frank learned that being powerful and connected couldn't protect his children from random criminals who were willing to take desperate risks, explained crime historian Nicholas Pileggi. The kidnapping showed him that family vulnerability was the price of fame and success. Frank Jr.'s singing career was permanently affected by the kidnapping publicity and psychological trauma. While he continued performing, he never achieved the success that might have been possible without the traumatic interruption and ongoing psychological effects. The financial cost of the kidnapping extended beyond the potential ransom payment. Frank hired additional security for his family, installed sophisticated alarm systems at his homes, and changed his lifestyle to reduce his children's exposure to potential criminal targeting. Media coverage of the Sinatra family became more intrusive and hostile after the kidnapping, as publications that had previously respected Frank's privacy began treating his personal life as public property that could be exploited for commercial purposes. The legacy of terror. The kidnapping of Frank Jr. remains one of the most shocking celebrity crime stories in entertainment history, demonstrating how criminal targeting of family members could devastate even the most powerful and protected public figures. From a law enforcement perspective, the case proved that amateur criminals could create enormous disruption and trauma even when their planning was poor and their ultimate capture was inevitable. The psychological damage often exceeded the immediate physical danger. The media coverage established troubling precedents for exploiting celebrity family tragedies as entertainment content. The intense publicity surrounding the kidnapping and trial showed how personal trauma could become public spectacle that prolonged and amplified the original suffering. For the Sinatra family, the kidnapping marked the end of innocence and the beginning of permanent vigilance about personal safety. Frank's children would never again enjoy the casual freedom that most young people take for granted. The case also demonstrated the complex relationship between celebrity, wealth, and criminal targeting. Frank's success and visibility made his family attractive targets, while his resources and connections provided protection that was ultimately insufficient against determined criminals. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate family to influence how other celebrities approached personal security and family protection. The kidnapping showed that fame created vulnerabilities that no amount of money or influence could completely eliminate. Contemporary celebrity families still study the Sinatra kidnapping as a cautionary example of how criminal exploitation can target family members to attack successful public figures indirectly. The case established security protocols and protective measures that remain relevant today. The story reminds us that success and power provide many advantages, but cannot protect against every form of criminal targeting, and that family vulnerability remains the greatest fear of public figures who understand that their visibility creates risks for everyone they love. If this story moved you, subscribe to the Sinatra Lost Vault and hit that notification bell. We're revealing the hidden traumas behind Frank Sinatra's public success that show the human cost of fame and the criminal exploitation that celebrity families still face today. What other celebrity family crimes do you want us to investigate? Let us know in the comments below.